Don't worry, you're safe with me.
Then I'll trust you.
For 17 years, one man's story was told by everyone except him. His people controlled every word. They shaped every narrative. They decided what the world would know and what would stay buried forever. But then he walked inches, and everything changed. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about power, truth, and who really controls the information we consume every single day. This isn't just a story about one person breaking free. This is about an entire hidden empire that nobody talks about. An empire so powerful, so carefully concealed, that most people don't even know it exists. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 shocking truths. First, how one family managed to control a man's entire narrative for nearly 2 decades without anyone noticing. Second, the hidden empire behind the scenes that made this possible. And third, what happened when he finally decided to tell his own story. This story will make you question authority. It will make you wonder who's really telling you the truth. And it might just change how you see the world. Let me show you exactly how this happened. In a world so advanced that technology could predict human behavior, there lived a man who represented something dangerous to the people in power. His name doesn't matter as much as what he knew. And what he knew could unravel everything. For 17 years, this man lived in a cage made of silence. Not a physical cage, not metal or concrete, but a cage built from carefully chosen words, filtered information, and people whose only job was to make sure he never spoke the truth out loud. His people, the ones closest to him, the ones everyone thought loved him, they became his prison guards. They weren't cruel about it. They were gentle. They smiled. They told him it was for his own protection. They said the world wasn't ready to hear what he had to say. They convinced him that his silence was actually his greatest strength. Every morning, he would wake up knowing that someone else would decide what he could say that day. Every interview, every public appearance, every message to the world, it all had to pass through their filters first. They shaped his words like clay. They removed the rough edges. They made him smooth and safe and acceptable. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was that he started to believe them. He started to think that maybe they were right. Maybe the world really wasn't ready. Maybe his silence was protecting people. Maybe this was just how things had to be. But deep down, buried under years of conditioning, something still burned inside him. A voice that wasn't theirs. A truth that was still his own. While his official representatives spoke for him, an entire empire was being built in the shadows. An empire that nobody talks about. An empire that had learned the greatest secret of all. You don't need violence to control people. You just need to control the information. This empire existed in plain sight. It operated through families like his. Through trusted advisors. Through people who smiled and nodded while they slowly tightened the chains of silence around the ones they claimed to love. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. They would find someone with potential. Someone with something important to say. Someone who could change minds and shift perspectives. And then they would surround that person with handlers. With advisors. With people whose sole purpose was to make sure that person's message stayed controlled. The man in our story didn't understand this at first. He thought his handlers were there to help him. He thought they had his best interests in mind. By the time he realized what was happening, he was too deep inside the system to escape. Years passed. 10, 15, 17. The man grew older, but his voice never grew stronger. It only became more controlled, more filtered, more distant from the truth he actually believed. People around the world knew his name. They recognized his face, but they didn't know him. They knew the version of him that the empire had created. They knew the carefully edited story. They knew the version of his life that served the purposes of those in power. But the Empire didn't expect what happened next. The Empire didn't expect him to wake up one morning and decide that 17 years was enough. They didn't expect him to realize that protecting a lie was destroying a life. They didn't expect him to choose his own truth over their comfort. And they definitely didn't expect him to walk in past all the handlers, past all the filters, past all the carefully constructed barriers, and tell his real story to the world. When that moment came, everything the Empire had built started to crack. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, word by word, truth by truth. The handlers panicked. The advisors scrambled. The Empire tried to contain the damage. But it was too late. The man had found his voice again. And once you find your own voice, you can never give it back. This is where our story truly begins. To understand how the Empire worked, you have to understand that power isn't always what it seems. The Empire didn't have headquarters. It didn't have a flag or a symbol. It didn't announce itself or make grand declarations. It worked quietly. It worked through relationships. It worked through the gentle manipulation of information. The Empire operated on a simple principle. Whoever controls the story controls reality itself. This principle had been proven true again and again throughout history. Kingdoms rose and fell based on whose version of events people believed. Movements succeeded or failed depending on who controlled the narrative. Wars were won and lost before a single shot was fired, simply because one side had managed to convince the world that their version of the truth was the only truth that mattered. The Empire or man had been trapped and understood this principle perfectly. They had studied history. They had learned from previous attempts at control. And they had developed a system that was far more sophisticated than anything that had come before. They didn't need armies. They didn't need prisons. They just needed to control information and the people who delivered that information. The system worked like this. First, they would identify someone important, someone with influence, someone whose voice could reach millions. They would watch this person carefully. They would learn their dreams and their fears. They would identify what motivated them and what frightened them most. Then came the second step. They would introduce handlers. These handlers would present themselves as advisors, as protectors, as people who understood the person's interests. They would be kind. They would be attentive. They would gradually become indispensable in the person's life. Over months and years, these handlers would slowly tighten their influence. They would suggest what the person should say in interviews. They would advise what topics to avoid. They would frame everything in terms of protection and care. They made the person believe that the restrictions they were placing on them were actually acts of love. The genius of the system was that the trapped person began to feel like they were part of the decision-making process. They would be asked questions like, "Don't you think it would be better if we approached this topic differently? Or wouldn't it be safer if we said this instead of that?" The person would then agree, believing they had made their own choice. But they hadn't. They had simply been led to the conclusion that the handlers had already decided on. The man in our story had been inside this system for so long that he couldn't remember what his own voice sounded like. He couldn't distinguish between his own thoughts and the thoughts that had been implanted into his mind by years of careful manipulation. But something changed. Perhaps it was a moment of clarity. Perhaps it was seeing how the Empire was using his silence to hurt others. Perhaps it was simply reaching a point where the pain of living someone else's life became greater than the fear of facing the consequences of breaking free. Whatever the reason, he began to wake up. It started small. A question here, a doubt there. He would catch himself about to say something filtered and wonder what his actual opinion was. He would sit alone and try to remember who he had been before the handlers came into his life. The Empire didn't notice at first. They were too confident. They had controlled him for so long that they didn't believe he could ever escape. But as his small acts of resistance grew into bigger questions, They began to realize that something was wrong. Their most controlled asset was starting to think for himself again. And a man who thinks for himself cannot be controlled. The handlers increased their efforts. They surrounded him more tightly. They limited his contact with the outside world even more. They tried to remind him why he needed them. They tried to convince him that the world wasn't ready for his real voice. But they were too late. He had already tasted freedom. He had already remembered what his own voice sounded like. And no amount of manipulation could make him forget again. The breaking point came on an ordinary day. There was nothing special about it. No dramatic music played. No lightning struck. He simply woke up and decided that he couldn't live this lie anymore. It started when he noticed something they couldn't control. A conversation with someone outside the Empire. Someone who looked him in the eyes and saw him, not the version of him they had created. This person asked him simple questions. Real questions. Questions that assumed he had his own thoughts and opinions and beliefs. Nobody had done that in 17 years. In that conversation, something shifted inside him. A part of him that had been sleeping for almost 2 decades suddenly woke up. It was like looking in a mirror and seeing his real face for the first time. He began to secretly document everything. Every filtered message. Every word that had been changed. Every instruction that had been given to him. He collected evidence of the manipulation so carefully and completely that even the Empire's spies couldn't detect what he was doing. Meanwhile, the handlers were getting desperate. They could feel him slipping away. So they tightened their grip even more. They tried new manipulation tactics. They attempted to isolate him completely. They even brought in new people to convince him that breaking free would destroy everything. But nothing worked. He had made a decision, and that decision was final. He was going to tell his story. His real story. Not the version the Empire had created. Not the filtered, carefully edited narrative they had been selling to the world. His actual truth. The Empire tried to stop him. They threatened him. They promised him comfort if he stayed silent. They warned him about the consequences of breaking free. They told him the world would turn against him. They said nobody would believe him. They predicted that his life would be ruined. He listened to all of it. He understood the risks. And he decided that telling the truth was worth the cost. Then came the moment where everything changed. He walked into a room full of cameras and people. The handlers tried to stop him. The Empire's representatives tried to block his path. But he kept walking forward. And then he opened his mouth. What came out was 17 years of suppressed truth. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't perfectly structured. It wasn't what the Empire wanted to hear. But it was real. It was honest. It was his. He described what it felt like to have your voice stolen. He explained how the Empire had systematically controlled every message he sent to the world. He revealed the manipulation tactics they had used. He showed the documentation he had collected. He told the world about the people who had pretended to love him while slowly suffocating his ability to speak freely. The impact was immediate and massive. Within hours, his story had spread across every platform. Within days, it was the most talked about thing in the world. Millions of people heard his truth and suddenly understood what had been happening all along. They saw the evidence. They heard his voice, his real voice, and they realized they had never actually heard it before. The Empire tried to respond. They denied everything. They claimed he was confused. They suggested that his mind had been compromised. They attempted to reframe the narrative once again. But this time, it didn't work. Because now everyone was listening. Now everyone knew what to look for. Now everyone understood how the manipulation worked. Other people who had been trapped inside the Empire system began to come forward. They shared their stories. They revealed their own evidence. They exposed the network of handlers and advisors and silent managers who had been controlling narratives and stealing voices for years. The empire that nobody talked about became the only thing anyone was talking about. And the man who had been silenced for 17 years became the voice that the entire world was listening to. Once one person broke free, everything accelerated. The empire had depended on secrecy and silence. It had survived because people didn't know it existed. It had thrived because victims didn't realize they were victims. But the moment the truth became public, the entire system began to collapse. More people came forward. Each person who spoke up gave courage to the next person. Each story revealed confirmed what others had suspected. What had seemed impossible, that an entire hidden empire could control multiple people simultaneously, suddenly seemed obvious. Researchers started digging into the empire's history. They discovered that this wasn't a new system. This had been happening for decades. The empire had controlled dozens of people. Hundreds, possibly. They had kept talented voices silent. They had suppressed important truths. They had shaped the world's understanding of reality according to their own interests. The man who had started the revolution, by telling his own story, became a symbol. He represented everyone who had been silenced. He represented the power of individual truth over institutional control. He represented the fact that no system, no matter how powerful, could ultimately stop someone from reclaiming their own voice. But the empire didn't simply disappear. It adapted. This was the second shocking revelation. The empire tried to control the narrative about the empire. They attempted to frame the man's story as an isolated incident. They suggested that he was a special case. They tried to convince the world that the system was being reformed and that everything would be better going forward. Some people believed them. Some people wanted to believe them. It was easier to accept the empire's promise of reform than to accept that an entire system built on deception would have to be completely dismantled. But the man and others like him refused to accept this compromise. They knew that the empire could never be reformed from within. It had to be exposed completely. Its methods had to be revealed so that nobody would ever fall for them again. This created a crucial moment in the story. The man had achieved something incredible. He had broken free. He had told his truth. He had inspired others. But now he faced a harder challenge, making sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. He began working with other freed individuals. They created systems to detect manipulation. They taught people how to recognize when their voices were being stolen. They built communities where silenced voices could be restored and amplified. The empire tried to discredit them. It tried to paint them as troublemakers and liars. It attempted to create doubt about their stories. But every time the empire tried to control the narrative, it only proved the point that had been made. The empire was still trying to control how people thought and what they believed. The world began to wake up to something much larger than the story of one man. The world began to understand that control of information is the most powerful tool that exists. And once you understand that, you start noticing it everywhere. People began questioning other narratives. They started asking who was controlling the stories they heard every day. They began to see the hands of hidden powers in places they had never noticed before. Some of these suspicions were valid. Some were exaggerated. Some were completely false. But the important thing was that people had woken up to the reality that narratives can be controlled, and that awareness changed everything. The hidden empire that nobody mentioned became a cautionary tale. It became a blueprint for how control actually works in the modern world. It became proof that individual truth, spoken with courage, can challenge even the most powerful systems. And the man who had been silenced for 17 years became a living example of what's possible when someone decides that their voice is worth fighting for. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The most shocking part isn't what the man revealed. It's what happened after he revealed it. In the months and years following his confession, The world changed in ways nobody predicted. The exposure of the hidden empire didn't just affect that one system. It sparked a global movement toward truth and transparency. People everywhere started demanding that the narratives being told to them should be honest and unfiltered. Governments began enacting new regulations about information control. Technology companies created systems to detect and flag manipulated content. Universities established programs dedicated to teaching people how to recognize propaganda and deception. The world collectively decided that what happened to this one man should never happen to anyone again. But something unexpected happened alongside all of this progress. The man himself changed. He had spent 17 years being controlled by others. He had learned to distrust his own voice. He had become accustomed to letting other people make decisions for him. Breaking free wasn't just about speaking the truth once. It was about learning who he was as a person all over again. In the beginning, he struggled with this. He had thought that telling his story once would solve everything. He had imagined that exposing the empire would somehow instantly heal the damage done to him. But it didn't work that way. Freedom, it turned out, was harder than captivity in some ways. When you're being controlled, at least you don't have to make decisions. At least someone else bears the responsibility. But when you're free, all of that falls on you. The man had to learn how to trust himself again. He had to rebuild his relationship with his own mind. He had to figure out who he actually was when nobody was controlling his narrative. This process was messy and painful. There were days when he wondered if breaking free had been worth it. There were moments when he questioned his own sanity. There were times when he missed the simplicity of captivity, even as he celebrated his freedom. But gradually, he began to discover who he really was. He discovered that his thoughts were actually worth listening to. He found that his perspective offered something valuable that the world needed to hear. He realized that his voice, when he was actually allowed to use it, could inspire and move people in ways that the empire's filtered version never could. More importantly, he discovered that he wasn't alone. Every person he met who had been inside the empire and managed to escape had gone through a similar process. Every freed voice had struggled with the same questions. Every person who had reclaimed their own narrative had experienced the same pain and confusion and eventual growth. Together, they built something new. They created a community of people who understood what it meant to have your voice stolen and to reclaim it. They became mentors to others who were still trapped in systems of control, showing them that escape was possible. The final revelation in this story isn't about the empire at all. It's about what the man learned about himself and about human nature. He learned that the empire worked because people wanted to be controlled. Not consciously, not deliberately, but deep down, control is comfortable. Having someone else make decisions for you means you can never be blamed for those decisions. Having your voice filtered means you're never responsible for the consequences of what you say. Freedom, by contrast, is terrifying. Freedom means responsibility. Freedom means accountability. Freedom means that the choices you make are actually your own, and you have to live with the consequences. But freedom also means something else. It means you get to be yourself. It means your voice actually matters. It means you're not living someone else's life anymore. The man understood that the real victory wasn't just about exposing the empire. It was about showing people that the cost of freedom is worth paying. It was about proving that reclaiming your own narrative, your own voice, your own identity is worth facing your deepest fears. And that's the most powerful message of all. Because once you understand this, you begin to see similar empires everywhere. You start noticing the ways that people, systems, and institutions attempt to control narratives. And you realize that the antidote to all of it is simple. People willing to speak their truth, no matter the cost. The man who was silenced for 17 years became the voice of a generation. And his story continues to inspire people everywhere to ask themselves one crucial question. Whose narrative am I living? Is it really mine? The deepest truth in this entire story isn't about the empire at all. It's about you. Because the empire that kept this man silent still exists. It operates in subtle ways. It works through systems that seem helpful and advisors that seem trustworthy. It steals voices quietly and effectively. And the question you need to ask yourself is simple. Is your voice actually yours? Are you saying what you really believe? Or what you've been taught to believe? Are you living your actual life? Or someone else's version of it? Have you let the need for approval and safety silence the truest parts of yourself? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them is the first step toward reclaiming your voice. The man in our story proved that it's never too late. Even after 17 years of silence, he found his voice again. Even after decades of manipulation, he reclaimed his identity. And if he could do it, so can you. Here's what you need to remember from this story. First, the most powerful form of control is information control. When someone controls the narrative, they control how people think about reality itself. Second, breaking free from any system of control requires courage. But it's always possible. No matter how trapped you feel, your voice is still yours. Third, reclaiming your narrative isn't just about you. It's about showing others that freedom is possible. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own voice and your own life, then I want you to do 3 things. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about hidden truths and untold narratives. Like this video and tell me in the comments, what truth have you been silent about? What narrative do you need to reclaim? Your answer might inspire someone else to find their voice. And if you want to go deeper into these ideas, if you want to join a community of people working to expose hidden systems and reclaim authentic narratives, join our newsletter. I'll send you exclusive stories, research, and resources that YouTube won't show you. The link is in the description. The hidden empire nobody mentions is counting on your silence. Your job is simple. Find your voice and use it.